The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. For anyone joining us for the first time, I'm your host, Cheryl Martin. I'm an emergency medical doctor, a yoga teacher, and I've got a particular interest in exercise and lifestyle aspects of medicine. This podcast explores all-encompassing views of health, well-being and performance. Many of you know I'm also a lifelong enthusiastic runner, and it's been really fascinating to see many people taking up more walking and running as a result of restrictions that have been placed on us to ensure safety and physical distancing through the COVID-19 pandemic. There was an interesting article in the media through the week suggesting that we are going to see a spike in overuse injuries as people may be unaccustomed to exercising and walking and running do more and make some of the common errors that the more veteran runners amongst us, to be honest, have made in the past and will continue to make. This idea of too much, too soon, too often with too little rest and recovery. But there's also the issue as we start to return to our team sports and exercising in ways that we have previously done, and a lack of sport-specific training through this period might also lead to injuries, and that's something that we might see across the spectrum of enthusiastic amateurs, even up to elites. Dr. Brandy Cole, we met in episode 1, spoke a bit about this, and she's got some really useful resources on her website. The past 2 episodes have also looked at how we're managing our anxiety and our stress levels through this unprecedented and very challenging period. And we spoke about this idea of trying to remain grounded and being where our feet are. I think today's guest marries both of these themes very well indeed.
I think people look at load and go, well, how often am I doing stuff and how much am I doing? But there's so much more involved than that. It's sleep, it's nutrition, it's our mental state, stress, what else? Like how we feel about ourselves. There's so much there that encompasses load.
That was the wisdom of Caleb McInnes. Caleb is a specialist sports podiatrist. He has dual qualifications in not only podiatry but also human biology and movement. He has a particular specialism in barefoot training and has been running his Feet Alive workshops for several years now. He's also recently incorporated amino neurofrequency into his practice. Caleb is an elite athlete himself and has represented Australia in the past in running, duathlon and triathlon. He's also a husband and father of 3. Caleb stands out for his whole person and individualised approach to his practice. And by the end of today's episode, I hope you, like me, will have a deeper appreciation for our fabulous foundations. So whether you're out on your feet, walking and jogging, or putting them up with a cuppa, please enjoy this conversation. Hi, Caleb. Thanks so much for joining me today. Firstly, how are you doing? How has work been? How are the family? And have you been managing to get any training in through this period?
Yeah. Look, to be honest, like apart from the kids not being at school and me being at home a little bit more, nothing's really changed. Like I've still been coming into the clinic. I've still been seeing patients. We've been doing a little bit of telehealth stuff.
Yeah. How's that been?
Training. Oh, look, I actually find it quite easy. I think probably the big problem is I don't think the general public get how much you can do on it. There's so much you can do, and it's just, I think, an education process around what you can and can't do and how much benefit you can actually be through a telehealth consult without actually having them in the room with you.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a medium of the future. I think we're all going to have to upskill, and it's definitely going to be a way forward. So it's interesting.
Oh, totally agree.
Yeah. And what about training? Have you managed to get some in? Have you got?
Yeah, training, like, again, hasn't really changed, if anything. Apart from swimming, obviously. Like, as a triathlete, swimming's a big part of that. So I really only went back to the pool last week. I tried to stay in the open water as long as I could, but I hate the cold.
Yeah, so, you need to come up here to Queensland.
I know, I'd love it. It's perfect up there. I've got mates up in Noosa, and they're still swimming in the beach and in the pool, and I'm like, oh man.
Although there was a few with wetsuits the other day. They're definitely starting to wear the wetsuits in the ocean.
Well, I saw someone the other day say that it was 22 degrees and they were in a wetsuit. I was like, really? That's crazy. It's going to get too hot in there.
It becomes very relative, I know. So I wanted to start by asking you, because I don't actually know the answer to this question. I don't actually know how, the foot became your life's work and how you actually came to be practicing as a sports podiatrist. So do you mind telling everyone?
Yeah. So it's a bit of an interesting journey. When I finished school, I really had no idea still what I wanted to do. And I went and did a Biomedical Science degree, which took me 3 years. I completed that. And then during that time, I did a bit of, I don't know about if you call it work experience, but observation stuff with a number of different professions across the health services, like osteos, physios, podiatrists and things. And I thought I wanted to be an osteopath, but then my mother-in-law is she's retired now, but was a podiatrist as well. And I think seeing some of the variety of stuff that she got to do sparked my interest a little bit more. I went digging a bit and found that we could do minor surgery. There was diabetes involved and high-risk stuff. There was the sports aspect, the biomechanics, and like just being sporty myself, the biomechanics and sports side of that, I suppose, really resonated with me. And then I kind of just evolved from there. I applied, went through the course. I think like every course, there's going to be things that you really enjoy and things that you don't. I enjoyed the sports part heaps, and then from there, pretty much out of uni, went straight into a clinic where I was the only podiatrist. I worked somewhere else for about 3 months, but then went straight into a clinic where I was the only podiatrist and kind of, I suppose, got thrown in the deep end a bit. Had to do my own research, bounce off other people, find mentors to learn things. And I think it took
Was it see one, do one, teach one?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, kind of to a degree, until it got to a point where I thought, hey, I'm doing all right at this stuff. Like, how can I learn more? So I actually started doing a few courses that were outside of the realm of podiatry, like the Barefoot Training Specialist, which you'll hear a bit of the stuff I've learnt in that hopefully today. And a few other courses that are, I suppose, from a podiatry world, a little bit left of centre, but made a whole heap of sense to me. And I've implemented lots of it into practice. Don't always implement it for everybody, but there's a significant portion of it that I do implement. And a lot of it's changed what I do, but for the better.
I find it interesting that you use the phrase left of centre. I know that for some time your practice has really incorporated a lot of emerging science, particularly in terms of neurophysiology, anatomy, and advances in human kinetics. And I really can't wait to explore some of these today. Do you think this is becoming more mainstream, however? I mean, and it's the direction that we're heading in?
Oh, look, I definitely think it's where we should be going. And I think if we look at footwear, which I think we're talking about in a minute, the research just doesn't really support shoes as a injury prevention or reducing risk factor. And I think we need to look at those things within the body and how we adapt to load and how we interpret like inputs from our body and then how we formulate outputs. That comes back to a lot of neuroanatomy, and the foot's got, as you would know, thousands of nerves in it.
Yes, great. So my own impression is that our feet are one of the more neglected and underappreciated parts of our bodies. Why are feet so important?
Yeah, definitely. I think they're probably one of the most underrated parts of the body. Like if we just look at the anatomy, we've got 26 bones, 33 joints, 120 ligaments. We've got 20 muscles just within the foot. And then we've got another 13 from below the knee that attach into the foot to help it function. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. And if we break that down, we take both feet and we break it down in terms of how much of the bones in the body does that actually make up, it's almost a quarter. It's super complex structure. And they have a lot to do. So I think if we break down the very basics of function, and I think most people would know what pronation is or would have heard of it before, which is essentially the rolling into the foot as we contact the ground. And then supination is where we essentially roll back out. They're essential for us for function. They help us adapt to terrain. Pronation is one of our natural inbuilt shock absorption systems. And then when we resupinate, it actually locks our foot as a rigid lever for propulsion. But it doesn't just lock our foot. It actually rotates essentially and locks in our whole entire lower limb so that we've got a stiff, rigid lever for propulsion. So looking further from that, I suppose there's a few main things that I'll probably highlight. It's not only important for us for static support or to maintain upright stance, but they help activate our postural muscles. It's involved in dynamic function, our walking and movement. And they're also a sensory gateway for a lot of stuff that comes in from the ground to help us react to it.
Yeah, I love that you highlight that what is going on in our feet, our foundations, has potential to influence our entire posture, gait, and have influence to not only our lower limb, but all the way up the entire kinetic chain and the whole body.
Yeah, definitely it does. I mean, look, I don't think we can ever isolate one structure and say it doesn't have an effect on anything else. And I don't think that just works from the foot. I think it works from up down as well. If something happens in one area, if it's working well, it's going to probably have a positive effect on some other area. If we've got one joint that's jammed up, if we take the ankle joint, for example, if that's jammed up, we're going to get some form of compensation for that. And it's either going to, it's not either going to, it's going to load up a joint either above or below it, probably in a negative way. Does it mean it's going to cause an injury? Not necessarily, but I think if you have something that's jammed up long enough and you put enough stress on other areas, at some point, there's probably going to be a problem arise. Who knows when that will be?
So I mentioned in the intro that we appear to be seeing more people walking, running, maybe taking up running for the first time, particularly as gyms and pools are closed and people are being forced to move in different ways. Firstly, are you seeing an uptick in your clinical practice yet in terms of overuse injuries? And from your perspective, what are the most common beginner errors that we make?
Yeah, I think, we are seeing it. To be honest, probably not seeing as much of it as what I thought we'd see. Why? I'm not sure. I'm wondering if there's been we're not quite at the point where people have increased enough, or whether they're still in that period where they're adapting, but they haven't quite hit their threshold to injure yet.
Or they're reticent to come.
Yeah.
That might be the other thing.
Exactly. We are seeing it, but probably not as much as what I thought we'd see it. And I think the biggest mistake that people make is doing too much too quick. And it's a simple thing what we call capacity versus load. So if your body doesn't have the capacity or hasn't adapted to the load, at some point down the track, it's not going to tolerate it enough. And that's generally when you're going to get broken or something's going to go wrong. So we need to give our body time to adapt to the stresses and the forces that we put on it. And depending on the tissue, whether it be bone, tendon, muscle, that's going to change a little bit. Tendon's usually the slowest to adapt, and that's generally where we'll see, I suppose, things go wrong or people come into the clinic with niggles in tendons, generally first before a lot of other stuff.
So you've already mentioned footwear, and I think this is a very interesting topic and it comes up frequently. If, for example, I am maybe do a bit of running, I'm still relatively new and I haven't maybe invested in a shoe yet, what advice can you give, if any, to someone maybe looking to go in and buy a shoe for more walking and running in the first instance?
That's a great question. I think the number one thing is don't choose your shoe based on emotion. So I actually read an article not that long ago that said something like 63% of people choose their shoe based on emotion, and the number one emotion they chose that on was color.
I was going to say that.
So
I was thinking of the Noosa Tri shoe.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a perfect example. I think, and don't get me wrong, I like to have a shoe that looks good.
The cool shoe.
Yeah, I like to have a shoe that looks good as well, but it's probably not the most important factor that we need to consider when we're looking for a shoe, especially if we're starting out. I think we also need to consider some of the features that shoe's got. Now, the current research suggests that support and cushion doesn't actually protect us against injury at all. But the number one thing that is I suppose, a predictor of injury when we talk about a shoe alone is the comfort factor. So if you go into a shop and you put a shoe on and it's not comfortable, my advice would be probably not to buy it. If it's not comfortable in the shop, it doesn't fit well in the shop, it's probably not going to be comfortable future forward. Or you're only wearing it for a short time in the shop. For people that are out there, some people are doing 100, 160, even longer events, even a marathon. Some people are out there for 4 hours. Probably not going to be comfortable if it's not over 4 hours, if it's not comfortable over 15 minutes.
And I mean, that was my understanding of all the literature and all the money that we put into this research over the years that we've come out with. If it doesn't feel right on, it's probably not the right shoe. It's quite interesting that's the main conclusion. Yeah. Should people maybe go on a treadmill in a shop then? Should they ideally have somewhere where they can actually use the shoe dynamically before they buy it? Or is just trying it on enough?
No. I think you're right. They need to put it on and go for a jog in it, see how it feels. Or a walk in it, whatever their activity happens to be. I suppose in answer to your question, I don't know what the research says around that. But to me, it makes sense that you would want to try and test it out as best you can in the conditions that you're going to use it. Now, I think if you're getting a netball shoe, you're probably not going to be able to have a netball court in the shop and run around in it like that. But if you're on a treadmill and you can go for a run in a straight line on it, it's probably the next best thing. So I think we've just got to go with what we've got at hand and make an informed decision based on the evidence that we've got at the given time.
Any advice you could give to the more established or veteran runners and walkers out there? Certainly modern day shoe marketing and technology has a myriad of different facets, stack and drop and cushioning.
So as I said before, number one thing, it's got to be comfortable. Number two, it's got to fit correctly. So probably the biggest factor I see, particularly in those who do distance or a half marathon and above, they buy their shoe too short. So I'm always looking for sort of 10 to 12 millimeters between the longest toe and the end of the shoe when standing. So don't do it sitting. Don't test that sitting down. Test that standing up because your foot's going to spread out a little bit. Number 3, there's a few features that I always look for to, I suppose, promote good foot function. When we talk about support as the first feature, as I said, the research doesn't support the fact that support does much or reduces the risk of injury. But when we look at what happens visually, there's still question marks for me around that to some degree, because we see changes in what it looks like on the outside of the shoe. Whether that's happening on the inside of the shoe, not sure. I think the second, probably one of the biggest factors for me is toe box shape. So in theory, from the ball of the foot forwards, it should be the widest part of our foot. And there's good reason for that. As we roll through our gait, so heel through the middle of the foot onto the toes, we're designed to splay for stability. And I'll often use this analogy with my patients in that if you were to open a jar, we never open a jar with our hand with our fingers squashed together. We always spread, we grip the top of the jar, and then we turn it. And it's because when we've got a wide spread or splayed hand or foot, we've got a lot more stability there for power. So
that's great.
When we talk about stability, it's essentially, I suppose, one of the biggest foundations through which we can actually generate power and force. And if we have a squashed or a narrow base that we can't splay and spread our toes, we're actually not going to be able to generate as much force and power. So toe box shape in general, when we look at shoes, most of them will actually taper in around the toe and squash them. So I think finding a shoe that's got plenty of width and plenty of room around the toe is essential. And I think you'll find that majority of people that go in and find one like that, they won't necessarily like it straight away because it's foreign. They'll be like, oh, I've got heaps of room in that shoe. But that's only because they're not used to having that room there for them to be able to splay. If we talk about the weight of the shoe, so this is an interesting one. It's pretty simple, and it goes into a little bit of physics, in fact. So if we look at our leg, from the hip down all the way to the end of our foot, it's essentially the longest lever arm in our body. So we can swing that like a pendulum. And if we look at a simple physics equation of force equals mass times acceleration, if we've got a heavy mass or a heavy shoe that's attached to a long lever arm that's moving or accelerating quickly as we swing through and go to strike the ground, we're then going to be subject to a greater force when we hit the ground. So if our body can't tolerate the forces of running already, which in some situations, if we calculate the force of the ground reaction force, which is essentially when we hit the ground, and add to that the muscular contraction force that occurs, we're sometimes up to 14 times body weight, depending on how fast we're going. So it's a lot of force going through the body. And if we add a heavy shoe to that, it's potentially even more. So the lighter the shoe that you can go, the better. Heel pitch. So I think where a lot of people get a little bit confused is the difference between stack and drop, or heel pitch and drop. And heel pitch and drop are essentially the same thing. That's where the difference between where the ball of your foot sits in the shoe and your heel sits in the shoe. Now, most shoes, this is actually coming down over the last couple of years, but I still think in general, and I might get this number wrong, but it's in the ballpark, it's about 10 to 12 millimeters is the difference between where your heel sits. So your heel's going to sit higher in most cases than what the ball of the foot's going to do. Now, there's pros and cons to that. So it's going to actually take pressure or compressive forces off the Achilles. So for anyone who's got an Achilles issue, I'll be going probably something with a little bit more drop to it. But we've also got to take into account that with greater drop, it also puts a little bit more pressure on our knee joint. So when we're prescribing shoes, we've got to take the patient's history into into account and then prescribe accordingly. The other thing with a shoe when we're, and I'll use those two joints for those two injuries again for an example, around cushion. So the Achilles, if we have a shoe with greater cushion, it unloads the Achilles, but it actually puts a little bit more force on the knee joint as well. So it's interesting that like there's actually a lot more science involved in it than just going, oh yeah, I'm going to have a 4 mil drop shoe, or I'm going to have a 10 mil drop shoe, or a 12 mil drop shoe.
Oh, geez, does that mean I can't buy a shoe that might be quite notable in the media at the moment and automatically run faster?
Yeah, you could. I think, look, it's got to be a combination of shoe and body, I think. Like, even the research around, and this is a little bit off topic right now, but even the research around the, let's say the Nike Next Percenter, or whatever.
Yeah.
I saw a thing. Some people out there listening will know Brad Beer or Simon Bartold, and some of the myths around the carbon fiber shoe. That like carbon fiber plates aren't new; they've been around for a long time. The plate doesn't have a spring effect; it's a lever effect. It doesn't actually flex that much. It just creates a lever effect, so only a bigger lever. Not all plates are the same. And this is the biggest one. Not everybody's going to run faster in a carbon-plated shoe. There's going to be variability for everybody. So for anybody out there going and buying a carbon-plated shoe, thinking that, yes, and getting excited about the fact that they're going to run faster, you probably are. I would say the majority of people probably are, but don't get disappointed if you don't.
How much of that is the old mind over matter might well kick in there. I am going to run faster, so I will. So it's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And then I read a thing. I was listening to a conference just the other week with Simon Bartold, who's one of probably the world's leading shoe researchers, and he said something like he was talking exactly about this in carbon plates, and he was saying that the foam in the shoe actually gives, like, if we look at the Nike Next Percenter, for example, which I think they say gives an average of 4% increase in performance, the foam gave 3% of that advantage and the carbon plate only 1%. So that's like probably contrary to what most people believe is actually happening. And the reason behind that is because the foam, the energy return in the foam that Nike's been able to give is huge compared to others. So off the top of my head, I don't have the exact figures in front of me right now, but it was something like 87 or 89% energy return in the Nike, when other shoes on the market in a similar category were only returning in the high 60% of energy return when we strike the ground. It's a massive difference. So,
it's very interesting.
Yeah, I found it interesting. And it's not something I knew.
Yeah. My colleague sent me a message or a picture of his new Nikes, saying that this was his plan to fend off his age-related depreciation in his running times. We'll see how he goes.
That's awesome. Let me know if he runs fast.
I suspect that he would be better seeing you and beginning to strengthen the intrinsic muscles in his feet and exploring some of the things that we're going to move on to talk about. So just before we move on to that, thinking about people that might already have some problems with their feet or know that they excessively pronate, supinate, or have some niggles, who needs to see you in terms of specialised advice about their footwear?
Yeah, well, I think pretty much anyone that's got an ache or a niggle that persists, or that's, I suppose, inhibiting them from doing what they want to do, whether that be discomfort or actual pain, because a lot of people will be able to push through things, even significant pains. A lot of people will push through, but it's not necessarily a good thing to do that. I think the first thing we need to work out is get a diagnosis. If we don't have a diagnosis, we don't know what we're dealing with, and it limits to some degree how quickly you're going to get better, because we don't exactly know what to do if we don't have a diagnosis. And then we can choose whatever treatment modality that we need to, whether that be advising on features of a shoe, whether it be putting strength in place, whether it be changing people's load. And load is a massive topic in and of itself. I think people look at load and go, well, how often am I doing stuff and how much am I doing? But there's so much more involved than that. It's sleep, it's nutrition, it's our mental state, stress. What else? Like how we feel about ourselves. There's so much there that encompasses load, and I think if I broke it down in a clinical scenario for me, it's probably the biggest aspect of my job that I have to manage with people to reduce the risk of injury.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm really curious about the number of people that come into you with, a sore foot or a niggle and probably aren't expecting to have a conversation about their diet, their sleep, what else is going on in their life that's potentially impacting this injury or their ability to recover or their ability to perform. And I mean, I think that's probably one of the cruxes of this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I would probably say the majority of people don't think I'm going to talk about it with them. And I would say the majority of people would think that I'm going to prescribe a more supportive shoe, potentially an orthotic, and maybe a few exercises. But for anybody that knows me or has seen me would know that I'm relatively conservative with the prescription of orthotics, only because I don't think they're a long-term fix. There is something that we can put in a shoe to unload someone or take stress off a structure. But like if we look at the foot as an example, and I don't think many people think of it this way, it abides by the same physiological principles as almost any other part of the body. It can be trained, it can be strengthened, it can decondition, it can be coordinated, it can be uncoordinated, it can become tight or stiff, and it can be mobile as well. And we can strengthen it. So we can do a whole heap of stuff around the foot. And I think the perfect example to illustrate this is that if you go to the gym, most people are going to go to the gym and train their back, their quads, probably their calves and arms and abs. But it's not very often, if at all, that people are actually whipping their shoes off and doing exercises to strengthen their feet.
So on the subject of bare feet, I know that you like to make a particular distinction between barefoot training versus barefoot running. And this idea of barefoot running has gathered a bit of interest and momentum in recent years. I wanted to talk a wee bit about the science and practical application of it. Given that the majority of us spend most of our days in some form of supported footwear, in reality, how realistic is it or applicable is it to start some form of barefoot running? Is it mostly hype?
Is it all hype? It's a really interesting question. Yeah, it's a really interesting question because do I prescribe to the whole barefoot running thing? I'd have to say no, I don't. But there's reason for it. I don't think most people can tolerate the amount of force or changes in load that are associated with it. So if we talk a little bit about the difference between barefoot running and barefoot training, which are entirely different, and if we just focus on barefoot running for a second, it's pretty much exactly that. And if I was to give advice to people around it, I'd say proceed with caution if you're considering doing it. Like, I'm not saying don't do it, but do it slowly. And if you are looking at doing it, there needs to be a significant transition period, particularly if you're going from a shoe that you've been wearing for a while with a greater stack. And in most maximal shoes now, which generally refer to the amount of cushion that's in there, you're going to sit slightly higher off the ground. You're just getting different inputs barefoot running than what you are, and different loads going through your barefoot running than what you are in a shoe. So barefoot running, while I'm okay with the idea of it, proceed with caution if you're going to do it. Barefoot training, on the other hand, is an entirely different case. I believe that every person, or nearly every person, can tolerate barefoot training in some way, shape, or form. And the reason behind that is that it's generally low load, so there's not a lot of stress going through us. It's essentially a form of what we call neuromuscular training, which I suppose is used in a lot of ways to help us maintain balance and increase the sensitivity of a lot of those little nerve receptors in the sole of the foot, which give us a lot of information coming in. We process that information, and then that actually tells us to some degree how we move. Now, our vestibular system, which is in our ear, and our visual system also have a role in that. But if we look at the three biggest areas, it's the sole of the foot, it's our vestibular reflex, and our eyes that give us input to the body. So if we talk about neuromuscular training, it takes into consideration both, and it's going into a little bit of science and I suppose neuroanatomy here as well, the central nervous system, which is our brain and our spinal cord, but also our peripheral nervous system, which is essentially the nerves that go everywhere else and then feed back to the brain and spinal cord. And if we look at, I suppose, some examples of what this could be, yoga and Pilates are a perfect example. It's pretty rare that I see people wearing shoes in a Pilates studio or in a yoga studio. They're getting sensory feedback through the sole of their foot as they're doing that, which then helps with like our sensory input and can help enhance our movement patterns, muscle recruitment patterns, our proprioception, which is essentially joint awareness, and potentially our agility as well.
Yeah, I mean, I love this topic, and I know that you and I have had quite a few conversations in this respect over the years. If you ever get an opportunity to attend one of Caleb's Feet Alive workshops, I would highly recommend it. I really like this visual image of the idea of there being a core in your foot, and like your central core. It's really important to build that intrinsic strength. I know that we both follow the work of Irene Davis at the Spalding Institute, and much of your practice reflects much of the research that she has performed over the years. I'd love you to go into a bit more detail about how you work with clients and patients to help them build their foot core, but also strengthen the neural connections.
Yeah. So I think if we go back just a little bit on that, I think most people are coming in, well, actually, I'll even rephrase that. A lot of people will come in and tell me they have a flat foot or a high arch, or they're neutral, but like they're classifications of shape. They're not classifications of function. So what our foot looks like when we're standing still doesn't mimic necessarily what happens when we're moving. And it goes back a little bit to what I said before. So I'll assess like how the joints move. Are they tight? Are they mobile? Do they have good strength? Do they have good coordination? Can they control certain movements? Is there deformity in certain areas, which, like, based on history in the clinic for me, it's not overly common that I'm seeing someone who's got a truly deformed foot. From there's a whole heap of tests that I run them through to work out what I think they need to improve on, or maybe they don't need to improve on certain things too. But I think a lot of people don't expect that. And I think because it's a little bit, like I said right at the start, it's a little bit against the grain of what the traditional, probably what they expect a podiatrist to do. But it's almost unexpected for some people because it's something that they don't expect to have done or tested when they come and see me. they're almost expecting to go, oh yeah, let's have some tape put on and let's have an orthotic put on their shoe because I need more support. They don't necessarily consider the fact that their foot's weak or it's uncoordinated or the joint's jammed up, and that we can actually improve that.
And these interventions obviously take time. They're not a quick band-aid, as you said, an orthotic, a bit of taping. So how invested do you find people are generally in the process?
Look, it varies. And I suppose for me, it becomes an education process as well. So don't get me wrong, there's times where I will prescribe an orthotic because I think it's needed, but I'll educate that person on the fact that that's not necessarily a long-term fix. They're probably going to feel better as a result of having it there, but I'll often put the onus back on the patient to say things like, look, we can work together to get a good outcome here, and I can teach you a lot of stuff that's going to help, but I can't do it all for you. And I don't think any practitioner can do everything for the patient to get the best possible outcome. I think you've got to work as a team, practitioner and patient, client, whatever you want to call it, to get the best outcome, and both have to put in their best effort throughout the process.
Okay, I've written something down here. You mentioned yoga and Pilates earlier and toe yoga, and my radar obviously pricked up. I wanted to talk a wee bit about the important role of the big toe, and particularly that first metatarsal phalangeal joint, so the ball of the big toe, in when we're cueing, so the physical practice in yoga, the asana, so the postures. Many of the poses we encourage students to direct their attention and awareness to push down through the ball of the big toe. It's obviously very important in balance and stability. And when I see patients in the ED or who have fractured or injured their big toe, I'm probably more interested in that than any of the other little toes in the feet, because it's so important for balance. And, you know, if you're an elderly patient who's broken your big toe, that potentially is a big deal. So I wondered if you could indulge me a wee bit on the big toe and its important role.
Yeah, I think you're 100% correct. Like, the big toe is crazy important. I always say to people it's big for a reason, because it's where we want to push our force through as we propel through gait. It's also big because it's a big stability point for it. And I often liken it, when I'm explaining things in the clinic, to a tripod. So if you set a camera on top of a tripod, we've got 3 points of contact on the ground. If you take one of those points away, that tripod's not going to stand up anymore. Or it might stand up and it might be wobbly, but at some point it's probably going to fall over. Exactly the same thing with our foot. So we have generally our heel in contact with the ground if we're standing still, and the ball of the foot, primarily our big toe and our fifth toe, because we've actually got an arch through the front of that foot, which not many people know about. If we lift particularly our big toe off the ground, which is, as I said, it's big, it's going to destabilize us. So I think a simple test for people to do at home is to whip their shoes off, stand on the floor, plug your big toe, your little toe, or spread your toes first. Plug your big toe, your little toe into the ground. Just press them in. Don't try and grip, just press. And then try and balance. Then lift your big toe off the ground. And I'll almost guarantee that the majority of people out there are going to be less stable once they lift that big toe than what they will be when it's down.
Yeah, and moving on to balance, because that's another one of my favourite pet topics. I always find it quite interesting that when you're assessing some of the young footy players for concussion testing and you have to assess their balance, baseline balance testing would be really useful because, you know, I suspect many of them would struggle on one leg, concussed or not concussed. Yeah, and I think the emerging supporting science here is so interesting. This idea of neurons that fire together, wire together, and you know, this is trainable, and it's so important as we age in terms of decreasing falls, which is one of the major things that I see through the emergency department in elderly patients. So I'm interested to know about your views on balance.
I think most people think they're pretty good at it. until you actually start breaking down little areas and educating them on what they should be able to do and what they maybe can't do. So I think, and actually one of the physios I work with put a great post on Instagram the other day, pretty much showing exactly this, that if you can balance without scrunching your toes or gripping, you're doing pretty well. But the majority of people that we see in the clinic stand on a single leg, shoes on, shoes off, doesn't matter, and they're actually clawing and gripping their toes. And it's what we call flexor stabilization. But it actually just overworks certain areas that don't need to overwork. And Nick said in his post the other day that there's a good argument that if you have to grip with your toes standing on a single leg, the exercise is too hard. And I think there is a good argument for that. Does it necessarily mean that I won't move on from that position? No. I might add stuff to it, but I'd still want them to be working on that, because I think it's really important to have that base of support working well before we go and move on to higher level things.
Yeah, great. So in practical terms, how do you work with patients? What do you advise them to do in terms of if they're looking to improve their foot function, strength, their mobility, their balance? What simple practical exercises would you start with?
Yeah, so I think number one, I think if we're looking at it from a strengthening your feet perspective, get your shoes off more. It's probably the simplest one. Get them in touch with the ground, get them feeling things. And the simplest time to do this is when you're at home in a controlled environment. And it doesn't even have to be for a long time. So if it's something that you've never done before, it might be that you're only doing it for 5 or 10 minutes a day. If you're sitting down at work and you've got the ability to whip your shoes off, and I suppose at the moment there's still lots of people working at home due to COVID, don't put shoes on if you know you're going to be sitting down. Feel the ground. Number two, when you're under little load, wear a shoe that's got less support to it. It's going to make your feet work harder. So, like, to work every day where I'm up and down a bit, but there's people in an office situation, and it's not going to be suitable for everybody, but a barefoot shoe, for example, or a really light, flexible, thin-soled shoe is not necessarily a bad thing if we can teach ourselves to tolerate the loads that we're subject to when we're wearing that. It's definitely not something I'd be telling people to go and run in straight away, though. I think the third thing that I'll often get people to do, and people can try this out at home, is simply do an ankle circle. So just sit on the edge of a bench or something where you can't touch the floor and do 3 or 4 circles of your ankle and really explore it. Go as big and as wide as you can with pointing the toes, and try and make it as smooth as you can. It's likely that at some point through that circle, you're going to have a bit where it's like a bit shaky or it's not how it should be. And then you'll push through that area and then it'll be easy to control. And then you'll come back to it and you'll be like, oh, it's a bit shaky again, or feels a bit stiff almost. And then it'll smooth out. The idea behind that is that through that stiff or shaky area, you want to try and smooth out that circle the whole way around it. And then obviously do it in the opposite direction as well. There's another one that I'll often do. I call it toe yoga. Trying to keep the big toe on the ground. And you can do this seated or standing, doesn't matter. But trying to keep the big toe on the ground and then lifting your second, third, fourth, and fifth. And keeping your second, third, fourth, and fifth on the ground. And then lifting your big toe. Lots and lots of people find this messes with their brain big time because they're just not used to trying to isolate those muscles.
Yeah, again, I find this so fascinating, this idea of the neurons firing together, wiring together, and energy flows where intention and awareness goes. and it's neuroplasticity in motion essentially. But I've seen that in myself, when you're building those connections and you think, I can't do this, and then until you think I am doing this, over time it's I've seen that in many of my yoga asana practices in particular.
That's exactly right. And I think I'll tell a funny story actually. I went to a course, this is years ago now, in Sydney, and I was coming back and where I learnt some of these little exercises, and I was sitting on the plane and I whipped my shoes off, and I'm glad no one complained. But I was sitting next to this girl. She was in the window seat, I was in the aisle, and I sort of had my head down for probably the rest of the flight trying to do these exercises, and I couldn't for the life of me do them. And I could tell that she was looking at me a little bit weird, but she didn't say anything. And then eventually she got the courage up to sort of tap me on the shoulder and be like, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" And I ended up having a conversation with her about this course that I'd just been to around foot strength. And within about 5 minutes, she had her shoes off and was tried all these exercises. It was pretty cool. But it frustrated me because she could do every single one of them and I couldn't.
Talk about vocation. I love that. Excellent. So we've talked a bit about the foot strength, fascia, balance. The other thing I had on my list here was a bit about fascia and foot fascia, fascial release in the foot, the calf. It's obviously again another emerging area. I remember from your workshops, I have my exercises. I still use my spiky ball. I have my little routine. I probably don't practice it as often as I should, but it certainly makes me feel good when I do. So I wanted to know a wee bit about the science and the practical application and what your views on the importance of fascial releases.
I think it's still, the research is very unclear around it still. I know there's some research out there that says you actually can't change the length of it through compressing it without, I think it's a ridiculous amount of force, like 900 kilograms or so. It's like a steamroller going over it essentially. But your fascia is also very sensory. So it's got a lot of small nerve endings, which are very fast acting in there. And it's kind of like why people like touch or respond to touch. Because if we've got a ball under there, for example, under the bottom of our foot, and we're rolling on it, we're getting input to our nervous system, which, and you used the word neuroplasticity before, that creates an input for something to change. And it feels good. So I think when we come back to why we do it, I would say if it feels good to continue doing it. I would say if you're not getting any change, there'd be a question mark in my head as to whether it's something that is the right thing for you to do. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as a yoga instructor.
Yeah, I find that interesting that you've asked me that from the yoga teacher perspective and not from the doctor's perspective, because I think, emerging information and research and advances in applied anatomy and ideas around skeletal variants, for example, or the role of fascia are quite new and emerging concepts, and not something I was ever taught or aware of as a medical student. So if we take skeletal variants, for example, I was taught there's a male pelvis and there's a female pelvis and they're different, whereas now I kind of appreciate that there's lots of shades of grey, both between and intra-sex. So one person's femur and acetabulum will potentially articulate different from another's. And that's got lots of biomechanical implications. And fascia, fascinating fascia, this idea of this connective tissue that probably has neural input and can change as we sleep and has a really important role in our mobility and potentially so much more that we've not quite realized yet. Very interesting areas, and be interested to see where the science goes. And again, it's for us, it's the clinical and the practical application. And the other thing that you mentioned, this idea of touch being important and the sensory feedback from rolling out your feet, for example. I was reading this week that that we're currently experiencing a distinct lack of touch, many of us, and that's potentially a problem. This idea of molecules of emotion I think that there's definitely something in that.
There's a lot of people that don't like it, but I think, and it's again going off topic. It's a huge topic. I think it becomes an emotional thing as well.
Yeah, but that's it, and I think you've already pointed to that. It's mind and body are intimately linked, and you alluded to this when you talked about load. The fact that it's not one specific thing, and you have to take a whole person, whole system approach, and look at many aspects of lifestyle, so physical, mental, and emotional. And again, this has been a recurring thread through the practitioners that I've already spoken to in terms of their approach and their application in clinical practice. To help people achieve optimal health, well-being, performance.
The body has so many systems, and no system works in isolation. They have to work together to maximize somebody's potential or somebody's health. Is just how I think about it.
Yeah, and someone like yourself who, as you say, a two-way relationship. You've got to be invested, and you're there as with your expertise, with your encouragement and your support. But it is a relationship, and it's something that develops over time. So I just wanted to touch briefly on the neuroamino frequency technique that you have been training and working with. I have to admit that I don't know very much about it, so be grateful if you would give us a little overview.
Yeah, so in short, it's a frequency therapy. That the company that developed it, they market it very much as the use of discs, which are embedded with a frequency. And when we look at the body, different things like everything's energy, everything vibrates, and we can help normalize that system with frequency. Um, it's an extremely holistic approach. If we look into it from a physiology perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's because it's more physics based. So it's been around for a long, long time. Einstein actually came up with the theory around it, and I don't have his exact quote here, but he said something like frequency is the medicine of the future. Um, and I've been using it a bit. Over the last probably 18 months and getting amazing results. The evidence around how it works in terms of frequency and its interaction with the body is actually quite strong. The evidence around it from a clinical practice perspective is still a long way behind. It's only been around in clinical practice for about 5 years.
Is that because there's not been much robust clinically applicable research done in the area to date?
Yeah, 100%. There just hasn't been the clinical studies done yet. Yeah, and I think with any new modality, and I think you'll agree with this, it takes time for that stuff to filter through. I'd like to think that I'm kind of an early adapter with it. I only found out about it from another physio that's been doing it, and like there's 8 levels of it, and as you go through, you learn more and more. But I think, would I do it without having access to the discs with the embedded frequencies? Absolutely, because I've learned so much about body function, like at an organ level, at a nervous system level, at an emotional level, and how that links back to, or even lymphatics, and how that links back to healing, immune system health, antioxidants, and injury healing, or health in general out of it, that it's enhanced my practice massively.
Okay, before we finish up, a couple of quick fire questions, probably mostly for my benefit, but I'm pretty sure there's quite a few people listening that will be very interested in your answers. Runner's toenails. Am I destined to have manky feet forever? Is there a cure?
That's a ripper. It's probably one of the biggest things that we see in runners. I think it's essentially pressure, and most of the time it's due to ill-fitting shoes. Um, it's probably not as common in people that do those shorter distances. Um, just because they're not subject to the same amount of pressure for a long period of time. But it's trauma from pressure, and generally because we're sliding in the shoe or because the shoe's too small. And I think we've got to consider the fact that the longer we go in terms of time or distance, which is they're usually synonymous, we swell up as well. So if we swell up, we're actually taking up space in the shoe, which is then subjecting the foot or the toes to more pressure. So biggest tip there for people, I'll say particularly that run probably half marathon up, if you're getting issues, go a little bit bigger than what you actually think you need in the shoe lengthwise, and just change your lacing technique to lock yourself in so that you're not sliding around.
Great. And just one more on that. Again, you probably could go all day on blisters. Top tips for blisters?
Reduce moisture and reduce friction. So moisture, socks are gold. Get a technical sock that's moisture wicking as number one. Number two, have your lacing technique done in such a way, there's a thing called like a little heel lock thing that you can do. You'll be able to Google it, anyone who's out there that wants to. But it's essentially like creating a little pulley system through the top two eyelets of your shoelace to lock you in to prevent that slippage. But blisters are a combination of moisture and friction. So if you sweat a lot and you can't allow that moisture to wick away or dry quickly, and then you're getting friction, you're most likely to get a blister. I think, what are they called? Engo blister patches are probably one of my favorites, and they actually attach to the shoe or to the insole, not to the foot, but they're gold. And then for anybody, like simple stuff that people can get at the chemist if they got a blister, like Compeed blister patches or a leave-in thin. The other big factor here is a lot of people will use like your Elastoplast, so your brown sports tape. It actually holds moisture. I would be leaning towards using more of like the white porous Fixable over those areas, or MeFix. There's heaps of them. Just because it breathes a little bit better, it doesn't hold moisture as much, and it just allows that moisture to wick away from the foot easier.
Great, thank you. And who needs to see you?
Well, I don't know. Anyone that's got a foot lower limb issue, I could deal with that for sure. Anyone who wants to try and strengthen their feet, improve their running technique, improve their load management, get out of orthotics, or if they or want advice on whether the orthotics they've got are right, or whether there's an option to get out of them. Some people there won't be an option, but I think the majority of people there's an option to get out of them if they're willing to put in the work to do it.
Great. And where can we find you?
Yeah, so I'm practicing at Thrive Sports Medicine in Victoria, in Melbourne, Victoria, out in Croydon. If you want,
I'll put a link.
Details, you can put a link, yeah. And then on Instagram, I'm at Caleb McInnes _podiatrist.
And are you still doing your workshops?
Yeah, I usually run them over spring and summertime, just because getting outside in the winter is too cold and often wet. But
excellent.
Yeah, details of those will go on the website when it's ready, when they're up.
Perfect.
I haven't actually got any scheduled right now, but.
So I've been finishing these episodes with a couple of questions for my guests. And the first one has been, what does good health mean to you?
That is extremely broad. I think good health has to encompass like both your physical, mental, and emotional state, and nutritional. I suppose that's physical as well. But putting yourself in a place where you've got as little stress as possible, you're as fit as you possibly can, you're eating well, you're in a state where mentally you're doing well. There's so much that encompasses good health, and I think if you feel good within yourself and you're doing some form of activity, then you're probably in a pretty good place.
And if you were to design your ideal self-care Sunday, what would it look like?
My ideal self-care Sunday. Whew. All right.
How would you spend your ideal Sunday?
I always get out most weeks I'll get out for my long ride. Sort of 3-ish hours on a Sunday, nice and early on a Sunday morning, and get in some morning sunlight, which I love. If I had the ideal, I'd probably then go have a coffee, eat breakfast with the family, maybe probably some pancakes or bacon and eggs or whatever, and then not have to do any work in the garden. That'd be perfect. Just spend time with your kids.
My mum would want to do work in the garden. That would be her ideal Sunday.
My wife loves working in the garden, but I hate it. So, yeah, it's just spending time with kids, family, and a bit of exercise would be perfect.
Perfect.
Maybe seeing a friend.
And in times of... Sounds good. I think that's been the common thread. Apart from the gardening, that's clearly going to be a controversial one moving forward. In times of professional or personal challenge, do you have your own go-to strategies? And any techniques that you work with? We've kind of spoken about mantras and affirmations and various things, but anything that you particularly consciously use when you are more challenged?
Yeah, for me, it's exercise. I need to get out on my own, away from other people, and just breathe, relax as best I can. And for me, exercise is one of the best ways I do that. I probably focus on my food a lot more, which I know a lot of people, when they're under stress or not feeling the best, will snack on, I'll say, fattier foods or the stuff that's probably not as healthy. But I'm almost the opposite. I'll go real hard on clean eating. Why, I don't know. It's just one of my, I suppose, coping strategies. And seeing friends for me is a big one. I really feed off being in a social environment and interacting with people.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time. There's been a lot of gold in there. And whether you're a walker, runner, or just a human being that has to walk upright, I think there's going to be something in there for you.
It's almost unexpected for some people because it's something that they don't expect to have done or tested when they come and see me. They're almost expecting to go, oh yeah, let's have some tape put on and let's have an orthotic put on their shoe because I need more support. They don't necessarily consider the fact that their foot's weak or it's uncoordinated or the joint's jammed up, and that we can actually improve that.
You have just been listening to Caleb McInnes. I'm sure that Caleb will agree with Leonardo da Vinci, who said that the human foot is a masterpiece of engineering and a work of art. I'm certainly persuaded of the need to take care of mine. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to joining you again next week. The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are, at this very minute, experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.